Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into something darker than you'd expect from a history lesson about food. This isn't about royal feasts or medieval recipes. This is about excess, about gluttony so extreme it became a weapon, about a king who literally ate himself to death and took half his court with him along the way. Before we begin, if you're here to relax, to learn, or maybe drift off to something strangely fascinating, go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and maybe, just maybe, don't eat while listening to this one, because by the end you'll understand why Henry VIII's diet wasn't just disgusting, it was fatal. In 1547, King Henry VIII of England died at the age of 55. His body was so enormous, so grotesquely swollen, that his coffin exploded during transport. Fluids leaked through the wood. The stench was unbearable. Dogs reportedly licked the spillage from the floor. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bad luck or a mystery illness. Henry VIII ate his way to that coffin. Deliberately. Obsessively. With a menu so revolting, so excessive, and so medically catastrophic that even his own physicians begged him to stop. What he consumed daily would kill most men in a year. He did it for decades. And the worst part, he knew exactly what he was doing. Let's rewind, because the man who died as a bloated, ulcerated tyrant didn't start that way. Henry VIII was born in 1491, the second son of Henry VII. And here's the thing, second sons weren't supposed to be kings. That honour went to his older brother, Arthur. Arthur got the crown. Arthur got the training. Arthur got the bride, a Spanish princess named Catherine of Aragon. Henry, he got the church. He was being groomed to be a priest, maybe a bishop. A life of moderation, prayer, and boring theological debates. A life of restraint. A life where appetite was something to suppress, not celebrate. But in 1502, Arthur died suddenly. Fever, maybe tuberculosis, no one's entirely sure. And just like that, 10-year-old Henry became the heir to the English throne. Everything changed. Now he wasn't just a backup, he was the future, and his father, paranoid and obsessed with securing the Tudor dynasty, kept him locked away, protected, controlled. Henry couldn't go anywhere without supervision, couldn't make his own decisions, couldn't choose his own friends or hobbies or meals. He was a bird in a gilded cage, and he hated every second of it. Every restriction, every limitation, every time someone told him no, you can't do that, you can't have that, you can't be that, it burned into him. When Henry VII died in 1509, 17-year-old Henry VIII didn't just inherit the throne, he exploded into it. Suddenly he could do anything, be anything, and what he wanted to be was the opposite of his father. Where Henry VII had been cautious and miserly, Henry VIII would be bold and extravagant. Where his father restricted him, Henry would indulge, endlessly, without apology, without limit. And that included food. Because here's what most people forget. Young Henry VIII was an athlete, tall over 6 feet, which was giant for the time, muscular, handsome, with reddish gold hair and a jawline that made him the heartthrob of Europe. He jousted, hunted, danced, played tennis and wrestled. The Venetian ambassador called him the handsomest sovereign I ever set eyes on. Henry didn't just eat to survive, he ate to celebrate, to show off, to prove that he, unlike his penny-pinching father, could afford the absolute best. His banquets weren't meals, they were performances. Entire roasted peacocks, refeathered and presented as if still alive, swans gliding across tables, dolphins and porpoises, yes, dolphins, served on silver platters, herons which taste like garbage but look spectacular, whole boars with apples in their mouths, carried in by servants while musicians played and jesters danced. It was theatre, it was power, it was a middle finger to every restriction his father had placed on him, and it was just the beginning. But even then, something was off. Because while young Henry could burn off the calories with hours of physical activity, his appetite was already abnormal. He didn't eat like a man fueling his body. He ate like a man trying to fill a void carved out by years of being told no, years of being controlled, years of being the spare, the backup, the one who didn't matter. Now he mattered. Now he was king, and he was going to consume everything his father denied him. Every pleasure, every excess, every bite, and that void, it was about to get a lot bigger. Let's talk about what Henry VIII actually ate. Because when I say disgusting, I'm not exaggerating. I'm not being dramatic, I'm being precise. His day started early, 6 in the morning, sometimes earlier. And breakfast wasn't a bowl of oats or a piece of toast. It was a full-scale assault on the digestive system, an opening salvo in a day-long war against his own body. Picture this. You wake up in Hampton Court Palace, you're Henry VIII. You've just rolled out of a bed, the size of a small car, attended by a dozen servants who literally watched you sleep. One of them hands you a chamber pot. Another wipes your royal rear end. You don't do anything yourself. Not even that. Now you're hungry, and breakfast arrives on silver platters. And it's not light. There's no concept of starting small. No easing into the day. You're getting ale, a gallon of it, yes, for breakfast, because water is filthy and might kill you, so beer is safer. It's weak beer, sure, small beer they called it, maybe 3% alcohol. But it's still beer, at dawn, before you've even fully woken up. Then comes the bread. Manchit bread, made from the finest white flour, because only peasants eat brown bread. Only the poor and the worthless consume anything coarse or common. This bread is soft, buttery, beautiful, and there's a mountain of it, loaves piled high, fresh from the ovens, still warm, and then the meat, always meat, beef, thick slabs of it, cold from the night before, pork fatty and glistening, mutton gamey and strong, sometimes all three, cold cuts, pies packed with flesh and gravy, leftover roast from the previous evening. Breakfast meat wasn't a side dish. It was the main event. It was the point. Thick, hard, aged cheese followed, sharp enough to make your eyes water, sometimes served with butter because why not add more fat? Fruit if you were feeling virtuous, but fruit was viewed with suspicion in Tudor England. Too watery, too fresh, might give you dysentery or upset your humours. So it was often cooked into preserves or pies rendered safe through sugar and heat. And this wasn't a small portion. We're talking 2 pounds of meat, minimum. Before 8 in the morning. Before most people today have finished their coffee, Henry VIII had consumed more protein than a modern bodybuilder eats in a day. But here's where it gets worse, because Henry didn't just eat a lot, he ate badly. The Tudor diet was almost entirely devoid of vegetables. They were considered peasant food, low food, beneath royalty. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots were what you fed to pigs and poor people. Leafy greens were viewed as rabbit food, suitable for animals, but not for men, especially not for kings. If you wanted to show status, you ate flesh. The richer you were, the less green was on your plate. The more meat, the more power. It was a direct correlation. Vegetarians didn't exist. The concept would have been laughable, suicidal even. So Henry's breakfast had basically zero fibre. No roughage, no balance, no vitamins beyond whatever accidentally survived the cooking process. Just protein, fat, carbs and alcohol. Every single morning. Day after day, year after year. And his physicians, they encouraged it. Because in the 1500s, medical theory was based on the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Every food, every substance, every element of existence was categorised as hot or cold, wet or dry, and these qualities had to be balanced for health. Meat was considered hot and dry, which was good for a king's robust, active lifestyle. It would increase blood, the humour associated with courage and vitality. Vegetables were cold and wet, which would make you weak and sickly, increase phlegm, make you passive and cowardly. So yeah, science, medieval science, told Henry to eat like this, told him that gorging on meat and avoiding vegetables was medically sound. Healthy even, necessary for maintaining his royal vigour. And he listened, because it confirmed what he already wanted to believe, that his appetite was right, that more was better, that excess was strength. By mid-morning he'd already consumed more calories than most modern adults eat in a day, and he was just getting started, because what nobody expected, not even Henry himself, was that a single moment would transform him from an athletic king into something else entirely, something slower, something angrier, something that would eat and eat and eat until there was nothing left but rage and rot. January 24th, 1536. This is the day everything went wrong, the day the athletic prince died and the monstrous tyrant was born. Henry VIII, now 44 years old, was still playing the hero, still jousting in full armour, still pretending he was the same vigorous young king from 1509. He wasn't. He'd already gained weight. His armour had to be let out multiple times. The metal panels expanded to accommodate a thickening waist. But he refused to slow down, refused to admit he was aging, refused to accept that maybe, just maybe, a 44-year-old man shouldn't be charging at other men on horseback while wearing over 200 pounds of steel. And on this day, during a jousting match, his horse collapsed, just went down. Whether the horse stumbled or had a heart attack or couldn't bear the combined weight of Henry and his armour, we don't know. But it fell. Hard. Henry, wearing full-plate armour, was thrown forward, and the horse, massive and panicked, landed on top of him, over 1,000 pounds of horseflesh crushing him into the dirt. He was unconscious for 2 hours, 2 hours where nobody knew if the King of England was alive or dead, 2 hours where the entire future of the Tudor dynasty hung in the balance. When he woke up, he had a severe concussion, possible brain damage, though they couldn't diagnose it as such. He complained of headaches for years afterward, mood swings, memory problems. But worse, much worse, was his leg. The impact had caused a wound on his thigh, a deep gash that quickly became infected. And this infection, this single wound, would never heal. Not in the 11 years Henry had left to live. It became a suppurating ulcer, constantly oozing pus and blood and fluid that smelled like death itself. Doctors tried everything they knew. Poultices made from herbs and honey, leeches to drain the bad blood, cauterization, literally burning the infected flesh with hot irons in a desperate attempt to stop the rot. Nothing worked. The infection had reached the bone, what we'd now call osteomyelitis, incurable in the pre-antibiotic age. From that moment on, Henry was in chronic pain, constant, grinding, inescapable pain that made every movement agony, every step, every shift in his chair, every time he stood or sat or tried to sleep. And when you're a king in constant agony, with limited options for relief, with no painkillers beyond alcohol and opium, which were unreliable and dangerous, you turn to the only consistent pleasure you have left, food. After the accident, Henry's activity levels plummeted. He couldn't joust anymore. The sport that had defined his youth, that had made him feel invincible, was gone. He couldn't hunt the way he used to, riding for hours through forests, chasing deer and boar. He couldn't dance for hours at court masques, couldn't wrestle his courtiers to show off his strength, couldn't even walk long distances without his legs screaming. He was confined to palaces, surrounded by servants and sycophants, trapped in his own body, which was betraying him more every day, and the only thing that brought him joy, the only thing that made him feel anything other than pain and rage and helplessness, was the next meal. So he ate, and ate, and ate. His waist, once a trim 32 inches, began to expand. By 1540, 4 years after the accident, it was 54 inches. by 1544, 58 inches. His legs swelled so badly he had to be carried in a chair, hoisted by servants who grunted under the load. His neck thickened until his face became a fleshy moon, jowls sagging, eyes small and piggish in the bloat. But it wasn't just vanity he was losing, it was his health, his mobility, his mind. Because what Henry didn't know, what nobody in Tudor England could have known, was that his diet wasn't just making him fat. It was poisoning him, slowly, methodically, one meal at a time. And here's the thing, the meals didn't stop at breakfast. By late morning, Henry was already thinking about dinner. Not the evening meal, no. In Tudor England, dinner was served around 10 or 11 in the morning, and it made breakfast look like a light snack. Dinner was the main event, the performance, the statement, and for a king like Henry, it wasn't just about eating, it was about dominance, about showing everyone in the room, everyone in Europe, everyone in history, that he could have anything he wanted, as much as he wanted, whenever he wanted, without consequence, without limit, without anyone telling him to stop. The royal kitchens at Hampton Court were a small city unto themselves. Over 200 staff worked there, not in the palace, in the kitchens. 200 human beings whose entire existence revolved around feeding one man and his court. Cooks, scullions, barsters, butchers, bakers, confectioners, spice masters, wine stewards, an army of labour dedicated to consumption. They worked in sweltering heat, massive fireplaces, each one large enough to roast an entire ox. And they did, roared day and night. The temperature in summer was like working inside a furnace. In winter, you'd be sweating near the fires and freezing if you stepped too far away. There was no comfortable temperature, just varying degrees of miserable. The smell of burning fat and charred meat filled the air constantly. Grease coated the walls, dripped from the ceilings, made the floors slippery and dangerous. Smoke stained everything black. There was no real ventilation beyond a few high windows, and the general architectural prayer that hot air rises. And every day they prepared a feast, not just for Henry, mind you. The royal court could number over 1,000 people, all of whom expected to be fed. But Henry's table, the king's table, was different. It wasn't about sustenance, it was about spectacle, it was about proving something. A typical dinner for Henry VIII might include a dozen courses, sometimes more, sometimes so many that even the record keepers lost count. And these weren't small courses, these were productions. Let's walk through what a normal Tuesday dinner might look like for the King of England in, say, 1540. First course, fish. Not because Henry particularly loved fish, but because variety was essential. Multiple species, each prepared differently. Salmon poached in wine, trout stuffed with herbs, pike, a massive freshwater predator, roasted whole and presented with its mouth propped open to look fierce. Carp swimming in butter sauce, and the lamprey, Henry's favourite, which looks like a parasitic nightmare, because it basically is. A jawless eel-like creature that latches onto other fish and sucks their blood. Lamprey was considered a delicacy. It was slippery, bony, fatty, and according to every account, difficult to eat without making a mess. But Henry loved it, had it prepared constantly. Lamprey pie was a particular favourite, the creatures chopped up and baked with wine and spices until the flesh fell apart. The fact that lamprey blood is mildly toxic, that it can cause nausea and digestive problems if not prepared correctly, apparently didn't bother anyone. Second course brought the birds, and not just any birds, swans reserved exclusively for royalty. Their meat was tough and fishy, and generally unpleasant, but they looked majestic. Peacocks, refeathered after roasting so they appeared alive, their tails fanned out in full display. The meat was dry and stringy, but again, appearance mattered more than taste. Herons, which tasted like muddy fish because that's what they ate. Bitterns, storks, cranes, all of them semi-aquatic birds that most people wouldn't dream of eating, But royalty did, because they could. Because excess meant consuming everything, even things that shouldn't be consumed. And then the smaller birds, larks, quail, partridge, pheasant, thrushes, blackbirds, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, baked into massive pies that, when cut open, would release live birds that had been placed in the crust after baking. A little dinner theatre while you ate the corpses of their relatives. Third course was meat, real meat, beef, entire rib roasts carried in by multiple servants, pork, whole suckling pigs with apples in their mouths and their skin crackling and golden, mutton, leg of lamb so large it required its own carving station, venison from the king's private hunting grounds, reserved for royalty because killing the king's deer was poaching, and poaching was a hanging offence. And game, wild boar, dangerous to hunt and even more dangerous to eat if not cooked properly. Rabbit, hare, sometimes squirrel if the hunting had been poor. All of it drowned in thick, buttery sauces made from wine and spices, and the drippings from the meat itself. Fourth course brought the pies. God, the pies. Tudor pies weren't like modern pies, they were architectural marvels. Massive constructions of pastry, sometimes 3 feet across, weighing 50 pounds or more. The crust wasn't meant to be eaten, it was more like an edible serving dish, baked so hard it could hold pounds of filling without collapsing. And the fillings were insane. Meat pies with multiple animals, beef and pork and chicken, all mixed together, with eggs and herbs and dried fruits. Sweet pies that were actually savoury, filled with liver and kidneys and sweetbreads. Eel pie, organ pie, pies within pies where cutting into one revealed another smaller pie inside, like Russian nesting dolls of meat. Fifth course was the subtleties, sugar sculptures and marzipan creations depicting scenes from mythology or current events. A castle under siege made entirely from spun sugar. A ship in full sail crafted from marchpane, which is basically fancy marzipan. These weren't meant to be eaten, or not entirely. They were art, propaganda, showing off the skill of Henry's confectioners, and more importantly, his wealth. Because sugar was expensive. Insanely expensive, imported from the Mediterranean or the New World at costs that would make you weep. A pound of sugar could cost more than a labourer's monthly wages, and Henry was using it to make sculptures, decorations, things that would be admired for an hour and then destroyed. Sixth course brought the jellies and creams, desserts sort of, elaborate constructions of flavoured gelatin, set in moulds shaped like animals, or crests or religious symbols. The gelatin came from boiling animal bones and cartilage for hours until they released their collagen. It was a laborious, time-consuming process that resulted in something that wiggled and tasted vaguely meaty even when flavoured with fruits and spices. Custards and creams and syllabubs, which were whipped cream mixed with wine and sugar. Tarts filled with dried fruits and nuts, marchpane shaped into fruits and painted to look real, candied flowers, actual flowers preserved in sugar, because why not? And this was just the official menu. Between courses there were palate cleansers, sorbets made from fruit and snow, hauled down from mountains and stored in ice houses if you were rich enough to have one. Wine constantly flowing, never stopping. Multiple varieties from light whites to heavy reds to sweet dessert wines that could strip paint. Side tables groaned under the weight of bread, cheese, nuts, dried fruits, bowls of butter, jugs of various sauces. Guests could graze constantly between courses, nibbling, tasting, never stopping. The meal lasted hours, 4, 5, sometimes 6 hours, of continuous eating, drinking, entertainment. Musicians played in the gallery, acrobats performed, jesters told jokes, often crude ones, often at the expense of people in the room who had to laugh along or risk offence. And through it all, Henry ate. He barely stopped to talk. His focus was entirely on the food. He'd gesture for more wine without looking at the server. He'd wipe his hands on the tablecloth, which was linen specially embroidered for the occasion, monogrammed with his initials. He'd gnaw meat directly off the bone, grease running down his chin and onto his doublet, then toss the bone over his shoulder for dogs to fight over. This was the King of England. This was the man who presented himself as chosen by God to rule. And he ate like a starving animal, publicly, while his court pretended this was normal. Admirable even, a sign of his vitality, his appetite for life. By the end of dinner, Henry would have consumed somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 calories in one meal, and he was only halfway through his day, because dinner wasn't the last meal. There was still supper to come, served around 6 in the evening. Lighter than dinner, supposedly, but still massive by any normal standard. More meat, more pies, more wine, more excess, and then after supper, after the court had dispersed and the entertainers had packed up and the servants were cleaning the great hall, Henry would retire to his private chambers, and he'd be hungry again, or claim to be, or just want more, and because he was king, more appeared. Let's talk about the night meals, the secret eating, the consumption that happened behind closed doors, where no records were kept and no witnesses remained, because the public feasts, as excessive as they were, weren't where the real damage happened. Those were performances. Henry was playing a role, the generous king, the vital monarch, the man so full of life he could out-eat anyone. But in private, the mask came off, and what remained was something darker, something compulsive, something that couldn't stop even when it wanted to. The gentlemen of the privy chamber, Henry's most intimate servants, were sworn to absolute secrecy about what happened in the king's private rooms. But fragments survive. Diary entries written in code, accounts from courtiers who glimpsed something they shouldn't have, inventories of food that went missing from larders with no official explanation, and the picture they paint is haunting. Henry would demand entire joints of cold meat in the middle of the night, leftover roasts from earlier in the day. Servants would drag themselves from sleep, stumble down to the kitchens, retrieve whatever meat they could find, bring it to the king's chambers on silver platters, and Henry would eat them with his hands, alone, sitting in a chair by the fire. No plates, no utensils, no pretense of royal dignity, just tearing at flesh like some cursed king from a dark fairy tale. He'd eat until his hands were slick with grease, until his beard was matted with fat, until his stomach was distended and aching, and he'd wash it down with wine, bottles of it, drinking directly from the vessel because there was nobody there to judge him, nobody to see, just the servants, and they didn't count. They were furniture, they were tools, they weren't really people in Henry's mind. Sometimes he'd demand pies at midnight, 2, 3 in the morning. Servants would wake the bakers, who'd have to fire up the ovens and prepare pastries in the dark. Rush jobs, often burned or undercooked. Henry would eat them anyway. Eat them hot, burning his mouth, not caring. Just needing that immediate satisfaction. That moment of pleasure in a life increasingly defined by pain. And sometimes, according to one particularly disturbing account from a servant who later fled England and wrote about his experiences, Henry would eat and then force himself to vomit. Not for health reasons, not to make room for more in the Roman vomitorium tradition, but because the act of eating had become more important than the food itself. The consumption was the point, the endless consumption, the never being satisfied, the void that no amount of food could fill, but that demanded more and more and more anyway. This is addiction. Textbook. The public eating was excessive, sure, but this private gorging, secret and compulsive, and done in isolation, this is where Henry's relationship with food crossed from excess into pathology. This is where the King of England became a patient, a sick man, someone who needed help but couldn't ask for it, because asking for help meant admitting weakness. And kings didn't admit weakness. Couldn't. Because weakness was vulnerability, and vulnerability was death. In a court where your closest advisor could become your executioner, where your most trusted friend could be arrested for treason on a whim, where your wife, the woman you'd moved heaven and earth to marry, could end up on the scaffold with her head rolling into a basket. You couldn't show weakness, you couldn't ask for help, you couldn't admit that maybe, just maybe, you'd lost control. So Henry ate, in secret, in shame, in desperation, and nobody stopped him. The servants who brought the food, who cleaned up afterward, who saw the King of England on his hands and knees reaching under furniture for a dropped piece of meat, they said nothing. Because saying something meant acknowledging reality. And acknowledging reality meant facing the fact that the most powerful man in England was deeply, profoundly sick. Easier to pretend, easier to bring the food and look away and collect your wages and hope that someone else would eventually intervene. But there was nobody else. Everyone was looking away. Everyone was pretending. The entire court, the entire kingdom, was complicit in this slow-motion suicide because nobody had the courage or the authority to make it stop. And the meals kept coming. Breakfast, dinner, supper, night feasts, day after day, month after month, year after year, an endless parade of consumption that was destroying the king from the inside out. But let's talk about what was actually happening to Henry's body, because the effects of this diet weren't just aesthetic. They weren't just about getting fat. The food was actively killing him, poisoning his organs, destroying his systems, turning his body into a biological disaster zone. Start with his gut. Henry's digestive system was under constant assault. He was consuming massive quantities of meat, much of it undercooked or borderline spoiled. Tudor England didn't have refrigeration. They had salt, smoke, and prayer. Meat was preserved by packing it in salt, which drew out moisture and inhibited bacterial growth. Sort of. Sometimes. But salt-preserved meat was still covered in bacteria, just slower-growing bacteria. And when that meat sat for weeks, which it often did, it would start to turn. The surface would become slimy. The smell would intensify. Flies would lay eggs that hatched into maggots. And the solution? Cut off the obviously rotten bits and serve the rest. Drown it in enough spices, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, to mask the taste of decay. The spices weren't there for flavour, not primarily. They were there to hide the fact that you were eating something that should have been buried days ago. Henry ate this constantly. His gut was a war zone. Bacterial infections were frequent. Food poisoning was a regular occurrence, so regular that it was just called having a bad stomach day. Parasites from undercooked pork and beef took up residence in his intestines. Tapeworms, roundworms, all sorts of lovely creatures that were stealing nutrients and releasing their own waste products into his system. And the lack of fibre meant chronic constipation. Henry would go days without a bowel movement. His abdomen would distend, swell up like he was pregnant. The pain was excruciating, and the solution, according to his physicians, was laxatives, powerful purgatives that would cause violent, explosive diarrhea. Henry would spend hours on his close stool, the Tudor version of a toilet, essentially a padded box with a hole cut in the top and a chamber pot underneath. He'd sit there, sweating and groaning and violently emptying his bowels while servants waited outside, trying not to listen, trying not to smell. And then once he'd purged everything, once his intestines were scraped raw and empty, he'd go right back to eating. The same meat, the same pies, the same food that had caused the problem in the first place, because the physicians told him that the constipation was caused by an imbalance of humours, not by his diet, that he needed to eat more hot, dry foods to counteract the cold, wet humours that were causing blockages. So he ate more meat, and the cycle continued. His liver was taking a beating too, not just from the food, but from the alcohol. Henry drank constantly. Wine with every meal, ale throughout the day, mead which is fermented honey, and essentially liquid sugar. Beer, though supposedly weak, in gallon quantities, the alcohol was processed by his liver, which converted it into less toxic compounds and released them into his bloodstream. But livers have limits. They can only process so much alcohol per hour. And Henry was drinking far beyond that limit, every day, for decades. His liver cells were dying faster than they could regenerate. The dead cells were being replaced by scar tissue. Fibrosis, which would eventually become cirrhosis. His liver was literally turning into a stiff fibrous lump that couldn't function properly. And a damaged liver affects everything. It's responsible for producing proteins that help blood clot, for filtering toxins from your bloodstream, for metabolizing nutrients, for storing vitamins, for producing bile that helps digest fats. As Henry's liver failed, his blood stopped clotting properly. Minor cuts would bleed for hours. His leg ulcers, unable to heal, would seep constantly. His gums bled. He'd wake up with blood on his pillow, from his nose bleeding during the night. Toxins that his liver couldn't filter would build up in his blood. These would affect his brain, causing confusion, mood swings, irritability, hepatic encephalopathy, basically brain fog caused by a failing liver. Henry would forget conversations, lose his train of thought mid-sentence, fly into rages over minor slights that he'd forget about an hour later. His skin took on a yellowish tinge, jaundice caused by bilirubin building up in his tissues. His eyes, once clear and blue, became yellowed and bloodshot. His urine was dark, almost brown. His feces were pale, clay-coloured, because his liver wasn't producing enough bile. And he was exhausted, constantly, deeply, profoundly tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. Because his liver was supposed to store glycogen, the energy source your body uses between meals. But his damaged liver couldn't store it properly. So he'd eat a massive meal, feel energized for an hour or two, then crash, feel exhausted, weak, and demand more food to bring his energy back up. It was a vicious cycle: eat, crash, eat more, crash harder. His body was running on fumes, desperately trying to keep up with demands it couldn't meet. His heart was struggling too. Your heart is a muscle. It needs a constant supply of oxygen and nutrients to function. But it's also responsible for pumping blood through your entire body. And as Henry gained weight, as his body expanded, his heart had to work harder. More blood vessels to supply, more tissue to oxygenate, more pressure to overcome. The heart muscle thickened, trying to keep up. Hypertrophy, it's called. But there's a limit to how thick a heart muscle can get before it stops working properly. The chambers don't fill completely. The walls don't contract efficiently. And Henry's diet wasn't helping. All that salt-preserved meat meant his sodium intake was through the roof. High sodium causes fluid retention and high blood pressure. His blood pressure was probably astronomical. No way to measure it in the 1540s, but modern cardiologists looking at descriptions of his symptoms estimate it was well into hypertensive crisis territory. High blood pressure means the heart has to work even harder to push blood through constricted vessels. The vessel walls get damaged, plaques form, atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries. His coronary arteries, the ones that supply his heart muscle, were probably narrowed by fatty deposits. And his heart, overworked and undersupplied with oxygen, was starting to fail. Congestive heart failure. Fluid would build up in his lungs, making it hard to breathe. He'd wake up at night gasping, feeling like he was drowning. Sleep apnea from the weight pressing on his airway. He'd stop breathing multiple times a night, wake up gasping, never achieving restful sleep. Fluid would pool in his legs and feet. Edema. His ankles would swell until they were twice their normal size. The skin would stretch tight and shiny. Press on it, and the indentation would remain for minutes. His legs, already damaged by the ulcers, became massive, swollen columns that could barely support his weight. And the pain. God, the pain. His joints were grinding bone on bone. The cartilage that's supposed to cushion your knees and hips was being compressed by weight it was never designed to support. Arthritis, severe and debilitating. Every step was agony. Every movement sent bolts of pain through his body. His spine was collapsing, the vertebrae compressed by the weight above them. Discs bulging and herniating, nerves being pinched, sciatica shooting down his legs. Back pain so severe he couldn't sit comfortably, couldn't lie down without pain, couldn't stand for more than a few minutes. He was essentially being crushed by his own body. Bones breaking under the strain, ligaments stretching and tearing, muscles working overtime to move a frame they weren't designed to move, and his physicians had no idea what to do. They'd bleed him, draining pints of blood in the belief it would balance his humours and reduce inflammation. Spoiler alert, it didn't. It just made him weaker, more anemic, more prone to infection, more exhausted. They'd take a man who was already dying and literally drain his life force, because medieval medicine was essentially systematic torture dressed up as treatment. They prescribed laxatives, powerful purgatives made from herbs and minerals that would cause violent cramping and diarrhea. They believed that expelling waste would cleanse his system, remove the bad humours. In reality, they were just dehydrating him, stripping his intestines of their protective lining, making everything worse. They applied poultices to his leg ulcers, mixtures of herbs, honey, sometimes ground up gemstones, because apparently Renaissance medicine thought rubies had healing properties. They'd pack these pastes into the weeping wounds, cover them with bandages, and hope for the best. The poultices did nothing. The infections raged on. The smell got worse. They tried cauterization. This is where it gets truly medieval. The physicians would heat iron rods in fire until they glowed red. Then they'd press them directly into the infected flesh. The theory was that burning would kill the infection, cauterize the wound, stop the bleeding. Henry, already in constant pain, endured this without anesthesia, because anesthesia didn't exist yet. Just alcohol, maybe some opium if you were lucky, and the leather strap you bit down on while screaming, the smell of his own flesh burning, the sound of it sizzling, the smoke rising from his leg while physicians held him down. And it didn't work. The infections were too deep, the damage too severe. The burns just added more trauma to tissue that was already dying, created more surface area for bacteria to colonize, made everything worse while adding the bonus of burn scars on top of infection. But through it all, the physicians kept telling him to eat more meat, because meat was strengthening. Meat would restore his vitality. Meat would help his body fight the infections. They genuinely believed this, and Henry, desperate for any solution that didn't involve restraint, believed them. So the cycle continued. Eat, suffer, treat the suffering with torture, eat more to recover from the treatment, suffer more. His body became a battleground, every system at war with itself, every organ struggling and failing, every day a new crisis that was managed, barely, until the next crisis arrived. And his mind? We need to talk about what was happening to Henry's mind, because the personality changes weren't just psychological, they were physiological. His brain was being damaged, starved of oxygen, poisoned by toxins his failing organs couldn't filter. The jousting accident in 1536 had given him a traumatic brain injury. Concussions weren't understood in the 1500s. There was no such thing as a neurological exam or a brain scan. You were unconscious, then you woke up, and if you could talk and walk, you were fine. Never mind the headaches, the mood swings, the memory problems, the personality changes. Modern neurologists looking at historical accounts suggest Henry suffered from post-concussion syndrome at minimum, possibly chronic traumatic encephalopathy, what we now call CTE, the same thing that affects boxers and football players, the kind of brain damage that comes from repeated impacts, or one really severe one. Symptoms? Irritability? Check. Mood swings? Absolutely. Depression? Definitely. Impulsivity? Oh yes. Difficulty with executive function? planning, decision-making, constantly. Paranoia, increasingly. Problems with memory and concentration throughout his later years. And on top of the brain injury, his diet was making it worse. Your brain needs glucose to function, but it also needs a steady supply, not the wild swings Henry was experiencing. He'd eat a massive meal, blood sugar would spike, he'd feel energized for an hour. Then it would crash, hard, and he'd feel foggy, irritable, desperate for more food to bring it back up. This is what happens when you eat nothing but meat and simple carbs and sugar. Your blood sugar roller coasters, and your brain, which needs steady fuel, suffers. You can't think clearly, can't regulate emotions properly. Everything feels more intense, more urgent, more catastrophic. Add in the hepatic encephalopathy. His failing liver couldn't filter ammonia and other toxins from his blood. These would cross the blood-brain barrier and poison his neurons, cause confusion, disorientation, mood disturbances, sometimes hallucinations, though those are harder to document in historical records because everybody was very careful about suggesting the king might be seeing things that weren't there. And the sleep deprivation. Henry wasn't sleeping properly. The sleep apnea meant he was waking up dozens of times a night, never achieving deep sleep. His leg pain meant he couldn't get comfortable. His racing thoughts, anxiety about his dynasty, paranoia about his court, guilt maybe about the people he'd killed, all of it kept him awake. Chronic sleep deprivation causes all sorts of cognitive problems. Impaired judgment, difficulty reading social cues, increased risk-taking, emotional volatility. Everything gets worse when you're not sleeping. So you had a man with a brain injury, metabolic dysfunction, liver failure, chronic pain, and severe sleep deprivation. All of it exacerbated by a diet that was actively poisoning him. And this man had absolute power. Could order executions with a word, could start wars, could destroy lives and families and entire religious orders. The Henry of the 1540s bore almost no resemblance to the charismatic young king of 1509. He was paranoid, convinced that everyone around him was plotting treason. He saw enemies everywhere. His final wife, Catherine Parr, nearly ended up on the chopping block after a religious argument. Only her quick thinking, grovelling, convincing Henry that she'd only been arguing to distract him from his pain saved her. He executed his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. She was 19 years old, maybe 20. He'd called her his rose without a thorn, his perfect young bride who would finally make him happy. Then he was told she'd had lovers before their marriage, possibly during it. The evidence was questionable. The confessions obtained under torture. But Henry didn't care. He had her beheaded, watched from a window, some accounts say, while she was executed, a teenager who'd been forced to marry a diseased, obese, violent man old enough to be her grandfather. And when she failed to live up to his impossible expectations, he killed her. He executed Thomas Cromwell, his most capable advisor, the man who'd engineered the break from Rome, who'd dissolved the monasteries, who'd made Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon possible. Cromwell failed to secure a satisfactory marriage alliance with Anne of Cleves. Henry didn't like Anne's appearance, didn't want to consummate the marriage, blamed Cromwell, and had him executed. No trial, no real evidence of wrongdoing, just the king's displeasure. And that was enough. Off with his head. He executed nobles, clergy, servants, anyone who fell out of favour or failed to show sufficient loyalty or looked at him wrong on a bad day. The court lived in terror, never knowing who would be next, never feeling safe, because the king was sick, physically sick, mentally sick, and his sickness was lethal. But here's the truly disturbing part. Henry's eating habits didn't just affect him. They set the standard for the entire Tudor court. Because in a hierarchical society, what the king does, everyone else mimics. If Henry gorged himself, his nobles felt obligated to do the same. To refuse food at the king's table was an insult. To eat less was to imply you were better than the king. that you had more self-control, more restraint, that you didn't need excess. And implying you were better than the king in any way was dangerous, potentially fatal. So they ate, they drank, they suffered through courses they didn't want, stomachs churning, feeling sick, knowing that to stop eating before the king stopped was a social death sentence, maybe a literal one if Henry was in a bad mood. Records show that many Tudor nobles developed similar health problems. Gout, caused by excessive meat and alcohol consumption, was rampant among the upper classes. It's a form of arthritis caused by uric acid crystals forming in your joints. Excruciatingly painful. Your big toe swells up like a balloon, turns red and hot. The slightest touch feels like broken glass grinding in your joint. And the treatment? Eat less meat, drink less alcohol, which nobles couldn't do because that meant eating less than the king. So they just suffered, hobbled around court on swollen feet, grimaced through the pain, and kept eating at royal banquets because the alternative was worse. Obesity was common among the wealthy, shortened lifespans, heart disease, diabetes, though they didn't have a name for it. They just called it wasting sickness. You'd eat constantly, but keep losing weight. Be constantly thirsty, urinate frequently, wounds wouldn't heal, vision would blur. Eventually, you'd slip into a coma and die. That was diabetes, caused by a lifetime of excessive sugar and carbohydrates overwhelming your pancreas until it couldn't produce enough insulin anymore. Your cells couldn't absorb glucose, so you'd starve while surrounded by plenty, your body consuming itself while you ate and never felt satisfied. The irony was lost on them. But it's stark from our perspective. These were the richest people in England. They had access to more food than 99% of the population, and they were dying from it, dying from excess while peasants starved, dying from the very abundance that was supposed to prove their superiority. And the waste, Jesus Christ, the waste, because Henry's court didn't just eat a lot, they threw away even more. Leftovers from the king's table were distributed to lower-ranking courtiers. Leftovers from the tables went to servants. Leftovers from servants went to the poor, if they were lucky, if there was anything left, if it hadn't already rotted. But the sheer volume meant that most food spoiled before it could be eaten. Entire animals, barely touched, discarded. A swan with one breast carved off, the rest thrown away. Pies with a single slice removed, left to mould. Wine spilled on tablecloths and left to sour because cleaning was someone else's problem. Servants would haul barrels of spoiled food to disposal pits. Just dump it. Mountains of rotting meat and mouldy bread and curdled cream. The smell attracted rats, thousands of them, which spread disease, which killed more people, which nobody connected back to the food waste because germ theory wouldn't be discovered for another 3 centuries. It was gluttony as performance art, excess as political statement, consumption as proof of power, and it was making everyone sick. But nobody dared say anything, because suggesting the king eat less, drink less, exercise restraint was unthinkable. You'd be accused of disloyalty, of disrespect, of questioning the king's judgment. And questioning the king's judgment was treason. And treason meant the executioner's axe, or worse, being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Hanged until almost dead. Cut down while still conscious. Your abdomen cut open. Your intestines pulled out while you watched, then dismembered. Your head cut off and displayed on a pike. Your body parts sent to different cities as a warning. That was the penalty for displeasing Henry VIII. That was what awaited anyone who suggested maybe, just maybe, the king should eat a salad. So they ate in silence, they drank through gritted teeth, and they watched the king slowly kill himself, knowing they were complicit. Knowing that history would remember this court not for its politics or its art or its contributions to civilization, but for its grotesque, pathological relationship with food. And in the royal kitchens the cooks kept preparing feasts, because orders were orders, and the king was always, always hungry, even as his body screamed for mercy, even as his physicians whispered that he didn't have long, even as the court held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Henry VIII was eating himself to death, and everyone knew it. Everyone except perhaps Henry himself, or maybe he knew. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the eating was suicide, slow, public, defiant suicide, by a man who couldn't admit he'd lost control of everything else, but could still control what went into his mouth. Let's talk about the final years. 1545, 1546, 1547, when Henry's body was shutting down, when every day was a struggle, when the end was visible to everyone, but nobody dared speak it out loud. By this point, Henry VIII was not just obese, he was grotesque, a medical impossibility, a man who should have died years ago, but kept going through sheer stubbornness and the efforts of dozens of people keeping him alive. His waist was somewhere between 58 and 62 inches, depending on which records you believe. For context, that's wider than most people are tall. His legs were so swollen with edema that they had to be wrapped in bandages daily. The fluid would seep through the cloth, leave wet stains. The bandages had to be changed multiple times a day. And the smell. We keep coming back to the smell because it's important. Because it tells you everything you need to know about how far Henry had fallen. The leg ulcers, now on both legs, oozed constantly. Pus and blood and necrotic tissue. The infections had reached the bone. Osteomyelitis spreading through his femurs. The smell was so overpowering that rooms had to be fumigated before and after he entered. Servants would burn incense, scatter herbs and flowers, open windows despite the cold, anything to make the air breathable. Courtiers would stuff sachets of lavender and rose petals into their clothing, hold pomanders, decorative balls filled with spices, under their noses when approaching the king. And Henry knew. How could he not? He could smell himself, could see people's faces when they entered his chambers. The way they'd try not to react, try not to flinch, try not to gag. He knew he was rotting, knew his body was betraying him, knew he'd become the thing he'd always feared, weak, dependent, pitiful. And his response was to eat more. Because food was the one thing that still worked, still brought pleasure, still made him feel for just a moment like maybe things were okay, like maybe he wasn't dying, like maybe if he just ate enough, drank enough, consumed enough, he could somehow outrun death itself. His face had become a bloated mask, jowls hanging like melted wax, eyes nearly swallowed by folds of fat. His neck had disappeared entirely, merging his head directly into his shoulders. When he breathed, it was laboured, wheezing, the sound of a man drowning on dry land. Sleep apnea certainly, though they didn't have a name for it. Henry would stop breathing multiple times a night, his airway collapsing under the weight of the flesh pressing down on it. He'd wake up gasping, terrified, feeling like he was suffocating. And he was. His own body was killing him. Slowly, inevitably. His servants, the ones who had to dress him, who had to bathe him, who had to clean him when he soiled himself because his bowel control was failing, they saw everything. Every ulcer, every sore, every inch of damaged, diseased flesh, and they had to maintain the fiction that everything was normal, that the king was just unwell, just having a bad spell, that he'd recover. But he wouldn't recover, couldn't. His organs were failing, his heart enlarged and struggling, his liver cirrhotic and barely functioning, his kidneys damaged beyond repair, his pancreas exhausted from decades of processing excessive sugar, his gut a wasteland of inflammation and infection. And still, the meals came, 3 times a day, plus night feasts, plus snacks whenever he demanded them. The kitchen staff, exhausted and terrified, kept cooking, kept preparing elaborate dishes that Henry would pick at, eat a few bites of, push away, demand something else, something different, something that would finally satisfy the hunger that couldn't be satisfied. Because it wasn't hunger for food, it was hunger for something else. Something food could never provide. Control, maybe, power, youth, health, the life he'd lost, the man he'd been, all the things that were slipping away no matter how much he consumed. Christmas 1546 was his last. The court gathered at Whitehall Palace for the traditional festivities. And even though Henry could barely move, even though he was visibly dying, the feasts went on. Had to go on. Because tradition demanded it. Because showing weakness was unacceptable. Because the King of England celebrated Christmas with feasting. Always had. Always would. The Great Hall was decorated. Holly and ivy and mistletoe. Candles everywhere, hundreds of them, making the space bright and warm despite the winter cold outside. Musicians in the gallery playing carols and dances, servants rushing back and forth with platters of food. And at the centre of it all, Henry, carried in on his chair because he couldn't walk, placed at the head of the high table like a grotesque centrepiece, his face red and sweating despite the cold, his breathing laboured, his hands shaking as he reached for wine. The feast was elaborate, even by Henry's standards. 12 courses, maybe more, all the traditional Christmas dishes, roasted boar, venison, swan, peacock, mince pies, plum pudding, wassail, a spiced ale traditionally drunk at Christmas, everything excess and abundance and celebration. And Henry ate, or tried to. He'd take a bite of something, chew slowly, struggle to swallow, take a sip of wine to wash it down, wave for the next course. His court watched, pretending not to watch, making conversation, laughing at the jesters' jokes, acting like everything was normal. But it wasn't normal. Everyone knew, everyone could see. The king was dying, right there at the table, dying slowly over roasted swan and plum pudding. And they had to smile and eat, and pretend like this was fine, like this was how things were supposed to be. After the feast, Henry was carried back to his chambers. He vomited for an hour, attendants holding buckets, cleaning him up, trying to make him comfortable. Then he slept, fitfully, waking every few hours, gasping for air, calling for wine, complaining about pain, demanding food, then pushing it away after one bite. His physicians conferred in hushed tones. They knew he was close, knew his body was shutting down, but they couldn't say it, couldn't tell him, because telling a king he's dying, even when it's obvious, is dangerous, even now, even at the end. January 1547. Henry was bedridden, couldn't get up, couldn't even sit up without help. His body had become too heavy, too damaged, too exhausted. He lay in his massive bed, propped up on pillows, struggling to breathe. But still food came. Servants brought trays, small portions now, because he couldn't eat much. Bits of meat. Bread soaked in wine to make it easier to swallow. Custards and creams. Anything soft, anything that wouldn't require chewing because his teeth were mostly gone and his jaw hurt. He'd take a bite, make a face, push it away, demand something else. The cycle repeating. The kitchen staff rushing to prepare whatever he wanted, knowing he wouldn't eat it. Preparing it anyway, because orders were orders, and the king was still the king, even when he was dying. His leg ulcers had become so infected that the physicians talked quietly about amputation, but they didn't dare, because cutting off a king's leg, even to save his life, was unthinkable. It would be an admission that he was damaged, broken, less than whole, and kings were supposed to be whole, perfect, chosen by God. So they just changed the bandages and applied more useless poultices and prayed that maybe, somehow the infections would clear on their own. They didn't. They got worse, the necrosis spreading, the smell intensifying, the pain becoming so severe that Henry would scream when the bandages were changed. And they gave him opiates, tinctures of poppy, crude, inconsistent preparations that sometimes helped and sometimes just made him confused and paranoid. He'd hallucinate, see enemies in the shadows, accuse servants of plotting against him, then drift off mid-sentence, mumbling nonsense. His courtiers, the ones allowed into his presence, had to maintain perfect composure, had to act like this was normal. Like the king wasn't lying there, rotting alive, rambling about conspiracies and demanding food he wouldn't eat. Because acknowledging reality was dangerous, even now, especially now. Because Henry still had the power to order executions, still had the authority to destroy lives with a word. And he was paranoid enough, sick enough, desperate enough that he might do it, might decide someone was disloyal, might sign a death warrant from his deathbed. So they smiled. They agreed with whatever he said. They brought food when he demanded it. They cleaned up when he vomited or soiled himself. They pretended everything was fine while watching the most powerful man in England decompose in front of them. January 27th, 1547. Henry woke up struggling to breathe more than usual. His skin was grey, his lips blue, his hands cold. The physicians were summoned immediately. They tried everything they knew. Bloodletting, which just made him weaker. Poultices on his chest, prayers. By evening it was clear. The king was dying. Actually dying. Not just sick, not just having a bad day. This was it. As was tradition, his closest advisors gathered around his bed. Edward Seymour, his brother-in-law, who would become Lord Protector for Henry's son. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. A few others, the men who would control England after Henry was gone. They asked if he wanted to confess his sins, receive last rites, make peace with God before the end. Henry, barely conscious, managed a weak gesture. Some accounts say he squeezed Archbishop Cranmer's hand. Others say he tried to speak, but couldn't form words. There was no dramatic final statement, no deathbed wisdom, no last words that would echo through history. Just a sick, exhausted, morbidly obese man letting go. Finally, after years of fighting, years of consuming, years of trying to fill a void that couldn't be filled, he died in the early hours of January 28th, 1547, 55 years old, King of England for 38 years, and his body, that monstrous, diseased, broken body, was finally still. The death was kept secret for 3 days. His advisors needed time to secure the transition of power, to make sure Henry's son Edward would succeed smoothly, to position themselves for advantage in the new regime. So Henry's corpse lay in his bed, cooling, while political machinations happened around him. And then came the preparation for burial. This is where things get truly grotesque, because Henry's body was massive. Estimates put his final weight somewhere between 375 and 400 pounds, maybe more. His corpse was bloated with fluids, swollen, and it was starting to decay. The embalmers, the people whose job was to prepare royal bodies for burial, had never dealt with anything like this. Standard embalming techniques involved removing the internal organs, packing the body cavity with preservatives, wrapping everything carefully. But Henry's body was too big, too damaged. The abdominal wall was so thick with fat they struggled to make incisions. And when they did open him up, the smell was unbearable. His organs were diseased, his abdominal cavity full of fluid, his intestines damaged and leaking. It was a biological disaster zone. Several embalmers had to leave the room to vomit. Others powered through, breathing through cloths soaked in vinegar, trying not to gag. They did their best, removed what they could, packed the cavity with herbs and spices, wrapped the body in cerements, wax-soaked cloths meant to preserve and contain, then placed the corpse in a lead-lined coffin, lead because it was waterproof, supposedly. Because they knew there would be leakage, they were trying to contain it. The coffin was sealed, enormous, custom-made because no standard coffin was large enough, and it was loaded onto a carriage for transport from London to Windsor Castle, where Henry, would be buried next to Jane Seymour, the wife who'd given him a son, the only one he'd asked to be buried beside. The funeral procession was elaborate. Thousands of mourners, real and performative, nobles in black, clergy chanting prayers, servants carrying banners, all the pomp and ceremony expected for a king, all the ritual meant to honour his reign and ease his passage to the afterlife. But during the journey something went wrong. The coffin, stressed by the weight inside, began to split. The lead lining had seams, and those seams, under pressure from the decomposing body and the fluids it was releasing, started to separate. By the time the procession stopped for the night at Sion Abbey, the coffin was leaking, not just a little, visibly leaking, fluids dripping onto the floor. The smell, even through the lead and wood and cerements, was terrible, inescapable. The coffin was placed in the Abbey chapel overnight. The procession would continue to Windsor in the morning. But by morning there was a problem, a big one. The coffin had leaked substantially during the night. There was a puddle on the floor, and dogs had gotten in. Multiple sources confirm this. Dogs, probably strays that lived around the Abbey, had entered the chapel, and they'd licked the fluids from the floor. The remains of Henry VIII, King of England, defender of the faith, supreme head of the Church of England, were being consumed by dogs. The symbolism was lost on no one. The king who'd consumed everything, everyone, had become food himself. The man who'd spent decades devouring had been devoured in turn, by animals, in a church, while his courts scrambled to clean up and pretend it hadn't happened. They scrubbed the floor, shooed the dogs away, resealed the coffin as best they could, and continued to Windsor, where Henry was buried quickly, hastily, before any more incidents could occur, before the decomposition became even more obvious. The funeral was elaborate, all the proper ceremonies, the prayers and rituals meant to honour a king, but everyone present knew the truth. They'd seen the leaking coffin, smelled the decay, knew that this glorious monarch, this powerful ruler, had ended as a grotesque cautionary tale. And in the years that followed, Henry's body continued to decompose in its tomb. The lead coffin contained it, mostly. But lead isn't perfect, doesn't seal completely. Over time, the coffin degraded, the contents leaked, and eventually, centuries later, when the tomb was opened for research, what remained was bones, fragments, the residue of excess. But before we close, we need to talk about legacy, because Henry's story doesn't end with his death. It continues through his children, through English history, through the food culture he influenced, through the lessons we still haven't learned about power and excess and the things we consume to fill the voids inside us. Henry's son, Edward VI, the precious male heir he'd destroyed lives to obtain, was sickly, weak. He'd inherited a fragile constitution, possibly from Henry's declining health at the time of conception, possibly from the inbreeding common in royal families, possibly just bad genetic luck. Edward reigned for 6 years, died at 15, probably tuberculosis, never married, never had children, never got to experience the long, prosperous reign his father had killed and schemed and eaten himself sick trying to secure. 6 years. That's all Henry's dynasty got from his legitimate son. All the wives, all the executions, all the religious upheaval and political chaos and personal destruction for 6 years. Then came Mary, Henry's daughter, with Catherine of Aragon, the wife he'd humiliated, divorced, cast aside. Mary had grown up watching her father destroy her mother, watching him marry woman after woman, watching him execute people who'd been kind to her, and she was angry. Mary I earned the nickname Bloody Mary for burning Protestant heretics. Over 280 people executed in 5 years. She was desperate to undo her father's religious reforms, to bring England back to Catholicism, to somehow revenge herself on the world that had treated her mother so badly. She failed, and died childless 5 years into her reign, possibly from ovarian cancer. possibly from complications of what she believed was pregnancy, but was actually tumours. And finally, Elizabeth, Henry's daughter with Anne Boleyn, the wife he'd beheaded. Elizabeth had learned from watching her father, learned that marriage was dangerous, that dependence was weakness, that power required ruthlessness and control. She refused to marry, refused to have children, refused to create the same desperate scramble for heirs that had defined her father's reign. Elizabeth I ruled for 45 years, became England's greatest monarch, ushered in a golden age of arts and exploration. But she was the end. The Tudor dynasty died with her. No direct descendants. Everything Henry had eaten and schemed and killed for ended in a childless queen who wanted nothing to do with his legacy. The succession passed to the Stuarts, descendants through Henry's sister. The Tudor line, the dynasty Henry had destroyed himself trying to secure, lasted 3 generations. His father, him, and his children, then gone. But Henry's influence on English food culture, that persisted. The Tudor obsession with meat, with excess, with displaying wealth through consumption, it became embedded in aristocratic culture. For centuries afterward, the English upper classes were known for their massive, meat-heavy meals, for their disdain of vegetables, for their gouty, red-faced noblemen who considered gluttony a sign of prosperity. The idea that real food meant meat, that vegetables were peasant fodder, that a proper meal required multiple courses of flesh, this became cultural dogma, lasted well into the Victorian era, contributed to all sorts of health problems among the wealthy. Gout, obesity, heart disease, digestive issues, constipation, all the same problems Henry suffered, repeated generation after generation because his court had normalised pathological eating. Even today, you can see echoes of Tudor excess in certain aspects of English cuisine. The massive Sunday roast, the full English breakfast with its multiple meats, the meat pies and puddings, the cultural assumption that a meal isn't complete without flesh. None of this is inherently bad, of course, but it's interesting how one king's dysfunctional relationship with food could influence centuries of culinary culture. How Henry's need to prove his power through consumption became a template that others followed, even when it was clearly killing them. Because that's the insidious thing about addiction, about excess, about using consumption to fill emotional voids. It never just affects you, it spreads, becomes normalized, gets passed down through generations who don't even remember why they're doing it, just that it's tradition, that it's how things are done. And here's the truly disturbing modern parallel. We live in a world of abundance now. At least many of us do, in wealthy countries. We have access to more food than any generation in human history. We can eat anything, anytime, anywhere. Calories are cheap and ubiquitous. Excess is easier than ever. And we're facing an epidemic of dietary disease that would make Henry VIII feel right at home. Obesity rates climbing, diabetes becoming common, heart disease killing more people than anything else, metabolic syndrome, fatty liver disease in people who don't drink. All the same problems Henry had, but now affecting millions. Because knowledge isn't enough. We know what healthy eating looks like. We have nutritional science. We understand that vegetables matter and fibre is important and balance is key. We have all the information Henry lacked. And yet, many of us still struggle, still eat too much, still use food for comfort, stress relief, entertainment, emotional regulation. Because food has never been just about nutrition. It's about everything else. Culture, emotion, identity, control, pleasure, connection. And when those other needs aren't being met, when we're stressed or lonely or anxious or depressed or just trying to survive in a world that feels overwhelming, food becomes the answer, the easy answer, the available answer. Henry didn't have our knowledge, didn't have our resources, but he had the same human vulnerability, the same capacity for addiction, the same ability to use consumption as a coping mechanism. the same tendency to fill emotional voids with physical substances. And he had something most of us don't have: unlimited enablers, an entire court whose job was to give him whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it, no matter the cost. Most of us have checks on our behaviour: friends who express concern, family who intervene, doctors who lecture, financial limitations, social consequences. Henry had none of that. Nobody to tell him no, nobody to stop him, nobody brave enough or powerful enough to intervene, and it killed him. So what's the lesson? Is it just don't eat too much? Is it that simple? Number. It's not about the food. It never was. Henry's problem wasn't that he liked meat, or enjoyed wine, or had a sweet tooth. His problem was that he used food to fill a void that food can't fill, that nothing external can fill. The void of insecurity, of inadequacy, of the gap between who you are and who you think you should be, of lost youth and failing health and disappointed hopes and the crushing weight of expectations. Henry spent his life trying to live up to an impossible standard: the perfect king, the perfect warrior, the perfect father of sons, the man his father never was, the ruler England needed, the legend he wanted to become. And when he couldn't, when his body failed him, and his wives disappointed him, and his heir came too late, and everything he touched seemed to decay, he turned to the one thing that never failed: his next meal. Food became his rebellion against mortality, his defiance of limits, his proof that he was still powerful, still in control, still capable of having what he wanted. But each meal only satisfied temporarily. And then the void returned, bigger than before, demanding more and more and more, until food wasn't pleasure anymore. It was compulsion, necessity. The only thing standing between him and the crushing weight of his own inadequacy. This is the tragedy of Henry VIII. Not that he ate too much, but that he thought food could save him. That excess could make him feel whole. That consumption could fill the unconquerable emptiness inside. It couldn't. It never can. It never does. And by the time he realised that, if he ever did, it was far too late. His body was already ruined, his legacy already written, his fate already sealed. So when we look back at Henry VIII, when we recount his disgusting diet and his grotesque end and his coffin-leaking fluids that dogs licked from chapel floors, we shouldn't just shake our heads at his gluttony. We should recognise the human pain underneath it, the desperate, endless hunger for something that food could never provide. Love, maybe, acceptance, peace, security, the son who would validate his existence, the body that wouldn't betray him, the father's approval he never received, the control over a kingdom that was constantly threatening to fracture, the certainty that he mattered, that his life meant something, that he wasn't just going to die and be forgotten like every other king who came before him. He never found it, and he died massive and rotting, still hungry, still searching, still trying to fill the void with one more meal, one more course, one more bite, but the void remained, untouched, unchanged, mocking every feast, every excess, every desperate attempt to satisfy the unsatisfiable. And in the end, all that remained was the body, bloated, broken, being consumed by the very decay it had courted for so long. The king who ate everything became food himself. The consumer was consumed. The glutton became a grotesque lesson that we're still learning 500 years later. But let's talk about the machinery that enabled Henry's destruction. Because his story isn't just about personal addiction. It's about systems, about the architecture of power that makes certain kinds of excess not just possible, but inevitable. Hampton Court's kitchens weren't just a workplace. They were an engine of suffering designed to feed one man's pathology. 200 people working in heat and smoke and grease. Children as young as 7 turning spits for hours until their arms went numb. Scullions scrubbing dishes with lye that burned their hands raw. cooks tasting every dish knowing that if the king got sick they might die. Butchers covered in blood and bile, bakers working through the night because the king wanted pie at 3 a.m. And none of them could say no, none of them could refuse, because refusing meant unemployment at best, execution at worst. They were trapped in a system that prioritized one man's appetite over their health, their safety, their lives, and they had families to feed, debts to pay, nowhere else to go. This is what excess looks like at scale. It's not just one person eating too much, it's an entire infrastructure of exploitation. Henry's pleasure demanded their pain. His consumption required their labour. His inability to stop eating meant they could never stop cooking. The system fed itself, perpetuated itself, made itself necessary, and everyone involved became complicit. The servants who brought the food, the advisors who stayed silent, the physicians who prescribed more meat, the courtiers who pretended everything was normal, the nobles who imitated his habits. The entire English court became a machine designed to enable one man's self-destruction. Because that's how power works. When someone has enough of it, when their desires become commands and their commands become law, everyone around them becomes an enabler. Not because they want to, but because the alternative is dangerous. Because saying no to power is risky. Because survival means participation. And this pattern repeats throughout history, throughout cultures. Whenever power becomes concentrated enough, whenever accountability disappears, whenever one person's wants override everyone else's needs, you get this: excess, exploitation, suffering dressed up as service, destruction marketed as duty. The Roman emperors who feasted while their people starved. The French aristocrats whose extravagance sparked revolution. The dictators and strongmen and corporate titans who consume resources, people, lives, in service of appetites that can never be satisfied. The specific details change. The underlying pattern remains. One person taking too much, everyone else making it possible. And nobody brave enough or powerful enough to make it stop until the whole system collapses. Until the body gives out. Until the revolution comes. Until the consequences can no longer be ignored. Henry VIII's kitchens are tourist attractions now. Hampton Court is a museum. People walk through those spaces and marvel at the historical significance. Look at the old fireplaces. Imagine the feasts. Take pictures. Buy souvenirs. The suffering has been sanitized. The exploitation erased. The human cost forgotten. But it happened every day for decades. Children worked themselves to exhaustion. Adults risked their lives. Families went hungry while the court gorged. And it was all legal, all proper, all part of the natural order where kings consume and servants serve. And nobody questions whether, maybe, just maybe, this entire system is fundamentally broken. And here's the uncomfortable question. How different are we? Really? We live in a world where billionaires exist while children starve, where obscene wealth concentrates while wages stagnate, where some people have so much they literally cannot spend it all, while others work 3 jobs and still can't make rent. The specifics have changed. We don't have kings and courts. We have CEOs and shareholders. We don't have servants in kitchens. We have workers in warehouses and factories and fields. But the pattern persists. Some people consuming vastly more than they need. Most people working to make that consumption possible. And a system that insists this is natural, normal, the way things have to be. Henry VIII ate himself to death while his kingdom struggled. Modern parallels abound. Leaders whose appetites for power, for wealth, for resources, for control, consume everything around them, who build empires on exploitation, who demand more and more and more while the people who make their excess possible suffer in silence. Because speaking up is dangerous, always has been, whether you're a Tudor kitchen boy or a modern whistleblower, whether you're facing the executioner's axe or professional retaliation. The specifics change. The risk remains. And most of us, if we're honest, are somewhere in the middle. Not the ones with absolute power, but not powerless either. We participate in systems of exploitation, buy products made by underpaid workers, consume resources extracted through environmental destruction, benefit from inequalities we didn't create, but also don't actively challenge. We're the courtiers at Henry's table, eating less than the king, but more than the servants, uncomfortable with the excess, but not uncomfortable enough to refuse, knowing something is wrong, but uncertain what to do about it, hoping someone else will fix things while we focus on our own survival. This is the real legacy of Henry VIII's disgusting diet. Not just the personal tragedy of one man's addiction, but the systemic tragedy of power structures that enable and reward excess, that punish restraint and celebrate consumption, that make one person's pathology into everyone else's problem. And until we address that, until we build systems with actual accountability, with genuine checks on power, with structures that prioritize collective well-being over individual appetite, we're going to keep producing Henrys. Maybe not literal gluttons, but people whose unchecked desires consume everything around them, who take more than they need because they can, because nobody stops them, because the system rewards excess and punishes restraint. Let's talk about the wives, because Henry's relationship with food mirrored his relationship with women. Both were about consumption. Both were about control. Both revealed his inability to accept that not everything in life could be bent to his will. His 6 wives, remember them? Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. The rhyme makes it memorable, makes it cute almost, but the reality was horror. Catherine of Aragon was his first wife, his brother's widow, married to secure a political alliance. She gave him a daughter, Mary, but no surviving sons, multiple pregnancies, multiple miscarriages, stillbirths, infant deaths, and Henry blamed her. Convinced himself that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow, even though he'd needed a special papal dispensation to do it in the first place. So he wanted a divorce. The Pope said no, and Henry, faced with a limit he couldn't accept, did what he always did when told no. He demolished everything in his path, broke from Rome, created the Church of England, made himself supreme head, dissolved monasteries, seized their wealth, executed anyone who opposed him, turned England upside down, all so he could marry Anne Boleyn. Anne was different, intelligent, educated, witty. She wouldn't be his mistress, insisted on marriage, made him work for it, and Henry, obsessed, rewrote the religious structure of England to have her. But once he had her, once she was his wife, the obsession faded. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, but no son. Another pregnancy ended in miscarriage, and Henry's interest turned to disgust. He had her arrested, charged with adultery, incest, treason. The charges were absurd, the evidence fabricated, the confessions obtained through torture. But Henry didn't care. He wanted her gone. And on May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded at the Tower of London. She was probably 35, maybe younger. Her daughter Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old. And Henry? He married Jane Seymour the next day. The next day, before Anne's body was cold. Because the appetite, once it fixates on the next thing, can't wait, can't delay, must consume immediately. Jane gave him what he wanted. A son, Edward, born October 12th, 1537. Henry was ecstatic. Finally, after everything, a male heir. But Jane died 12 days later from puerperal fever, a postpartum infection, and Henry was devastated. For about a month, then he started looking for wife number 4. Anne of Cleves was chosen based on a portrait, a political alliance with German Protestant states. She arrived in England. Henry met her, and was repulsed. She didn't look like her portrait, didn't speak English well, didn't match his expectations, and Henry, unable to admit he'd made a mistake, unable to accept that maybe his judgment wasn't infallible, blamed everyone else. The marriage was annulled after 6 months, not consummated supposedly. Anne was smart enough to agree to the annulment, got a generous settlement, multiple properties, an income, and her life, became known as the king's beloved sister, and lived quietly for another 17 years, outliving Henry by a decade. Then Catherine Howard, a teenager, 19, maybe 20, beautiful, vivacious, and doomed. Henry called her his rose without a thorn, showered her with gifts, proclaimed his renewed vitality. This young wife would rejuvenate him, make him young again, give him more sons. But Catherine had a past, relationships before marriage, possibly during it. The details are murky, the accusations questionable. But once Henry heard rumours, once his paranoia was triggered, it was over. She was arrested, interrogated, executed, February 13th, 1542, beheaded on the same scaffold where Anne Boleyn had died. And finally, Catherine Parr, the survivor. Widowed twice before marrying Henry, educated, intelligent, more nurse than wife at this point. Henry was sick, obese, dying. He needed someone to manage his care, not share his bed. Catherine did it well, managed the household, got along with Henry's children, navigated court politics carefully. She almost didn't survive, had a religious argument with Henry. He accused her of heresy, signed a warrant for her arrest, and only her quick thinking, her grovelling apology, her insistence that she'd only argued to distract him from his pain, saved her life. She had to humiliate herself, debase herself, convince a dying tyrant that she posed no threat, and it worked. She outlived him by a year. 6 wives, 2 beheaded, 2 divorced after being publicly humiliated, 1 dead from childbirth, 1 who escaped only through careful subservience. This is how Henry treated the women he claimed to love, the women he married, the women he'd promised to honour and cherish. He consumed them, used them, discarded them when they disappointed him, or killed them when they threatened his ego. And the parallel to food is exact, same pattern. Desire, pursuit, consumption, disappointment, disposal. Next course, next wife, next meal. The appetite never satisfied, always searching for the thing that will finally be enough. Never finding it. And the cruelty of it, the absolute cruelty. These were human beings, with thoughts and feelings and desires of their own, with families who loved them, with lives they wanted to live, and they were reduced to objects, tools for producing heirs, symbols of Henry's virility, things to be consumed and discarded based on one man's whims. Anne Boleyn went to her execution with dignity, said she'd been a faithful wife, asked for prayers, forgave the executioner before he killed her. She was murdered by the man who claimed to love her so desperately he'd rewritten England's religious laws to marry her, and then he married her replacement the next day. Catherine Howard was so terrified at her execution, she could barely stand. She was a child, a teenager forced to marry a diseased, obese, violent man, older than her father. And when she failed to be the perfect decorative object he wanted, when she dared to have a history, to have made choices before she belonged to him, she died for it. This is what unchecked power does to relationships. To love, if you can even call what Henry felt love, it turns people into commodities, into objects to be consumed. And when consumption is your primary mode of relating to the world, whether with food or people or power itself, everyone around you becomes disposable. The wives who survived did so through submission, through careful management of a tyrant's ego, through making themselves small and unthreatening, through accepting their role as appendages to his appetite, rather than full human beings with their own value. That's not survival. That's erasure, a different kind of death. And the women who didn't survive, they haunt English history, their stories reduced to rhymes and trivia, and Tudor tourism. Anne Boleyn's ghost, allegedly, walks the tower. Catherine Howard's screams supposedly echo through Hampton Court. We've turned their trauma into ghost stories, their murders into entertainment. But they were real. They suffered really, died really. Their fear was real. Their pain was real. And it all happened because one man couldn't accept limits, couldn't control his appetites, couldn't see other people as anything more than objects to consume. Henry's disgusting diet and his treatment of wives, they're the same story. The story of appetite unbound, of consumption as power, of a man who ate everything, everyone, until there was nothing left but rot. And we remember him. We make movies about him, write books, create museums, turn his appetites into history lessons. But we rarely talk about what it felt like to be consumed by him, to be food for his appetites, to be the wife or the servant or the advisor or the subject whose life was destroyed because the king was hungry and nobody could tell him no. That's the real disgusting part, not the menu, not the quantities, not even the medical horror of his deteriorating body, but the human cost, the lives consumed, the suffering enabled, the system that made all of it possible and called it normal, called it royal, called it the natural order of things. Let's talk about the final meal, the last thing Henry VIII ate before he died, because it matters. It's symbolic. It tells us everything about who he was at the end. And according to the records, fragmentary as they are, Henry's final food was lamprey pie. Lamprey, that parasitic, blood-sucking, eel-like nightmare that he'd loved for decades. Fatty, toxic if prepared wrong, difficult to eat, a delicacy that most people would refuse. And Henry wanted it, even at the end, even when he could barely swallow, even when his body was shutting down. He wanted the thing that had always brought him pleasure. They prepared it for him. Servants rushing to the kitchens, waking the cooks, finding lamprey, which wasn't easy in January, preparing the pie, making sure it was perfect. Because even dying, even obviously hours away from the end, the king's appetite had to be satisfied. And Henry ate some of it. A few bites, according to accounts, he chewed slowly, struggled to swallow, the effort visible on his face, but he ate it, because that's what he did. That's who he was, a man defined by consumption until the very last moment. The irony is devastating. His first meal as king, probably some lavish feast celebrating his coronation in 1509. Multiple courses, celebrating his youth and power and the beginning of his reign. And his last meal, alone in his chambers, struggling to swallow toxic fish while his body fell apart. The arc of his reign, from excess to excess, but the context completely changed. Young Henry eating to celebrate life, old Henry eating because it was all he had left. The trajectory of addiction in one image, from pleasure to compulsion, from choice to desperate need, from life-affirming to life-destroying. But the consumption never stopped, never paused, even when it was killing him, especially when it was killing him. Because that's the nature of addiction. It doesn't care that it's destroying you. It doesn't stop when things get bad. It accelerates, intensifies, becomes more desperate. The thing that once brought pleasure becomes the thing you need just to function, just to feel normal, just to get through another hour. And everyone around you watches it happen, watches you destroy yourself, wants to help but doesn't know how, or is too afraid, or has too much invested in the system that enables you. So they bring you lamprey pie at midnight when you're dying, because that's what you want, and they've spent so long giving you what you want that they don't know how to stop. Henry died a few hours after that meal, the lamprey undigested in his stomach, his final act of consumption incomplete. Even death couldn't wait for him to finish eating, and when they opened him up to embalm him, When they saw the state of his organs, the damage, the disease, did any of them think about the food? About the decades of excess that had led to this? Or did they just see a dead king? A body to prepare, a job to complete? Did they make the connection between the meals and the death? Or was it just bad luck, bad humours, God's will? We don't know. They didn't write it down. But we can guess that some of them knew. Some of the physicians, some of the servants, some of the people who'd watched him eat himself to death over decades. They knew. But they'd stayed silent. And now it was too late. The lamprey pie, the final meal, the last consumption. It's perfect in a horrible way. The perfect symbol for a life spent consuming. A king who loved food that was difficult and dangerous and expensive, who demanded it even when it made no sense, who couldn't let go of his appetites even at the moment of death. And somewhere in the Hampton Court kitchens, a cook who'd been woken at midnight to prepare that pie probably went back to sleep, exhausted, relieved, because the king was dead. And for the first time in decades, maybe in their entire career, they wouldn't have to wake up tomorrow and prepare another feast. Wouldn't have to feed the infinite appetite. Wouldn't have to participate in the slow-motion suicide. The machines of consumption could finally stop. The kitchens could cool. The fires could go out. The king who ate everything had finally been satisfied. By death. The only thing that could make him stop. So where does this leave us? After an hour and 40 minutes of disgusting details, medical horror, and systematic exploitation? What's the point of knowing all this about Henry VIII's diet? Is it just morbid curiosity? Historical voyeurism? Or is there something useful here? Because here's the thing. We tell ourselves we're different, that we've evolved, that we'd never enable a tyrant's self-destruction, never participate in systems of exploitation, never stay silent while someone consumed themselves and everyone around them. But would we, really? How many of us work for companies that destroy the environment because it's profitable? How many participate in systems that exploit workers, that concentrate wealth, that prioritize profit over human well-being? How many of us know something is wrong, but stay quiet because speaking up is risky? We're all Henry's servants in some way. Participating in consumption we know is destructive, enabling appetites we know can't be satisfied. Working within systems we know are broken because the alternative is uncertain. Bringing the metaphorical lamprey pie at midnight because that's what the system demands. And sometimes we're Henry, consuming more than we need, using external things to fill internal voids, telling ourselves this time will be different, this purchase, this meal, this whatever will finally make us feel whole, and being surprised when it doesn't, when the void remains, when the hunger persists, the specifics change, the pattern doesn't, human nature doesn't. We're still capable of the same excess, the same addiction, the same willingness to consume everything in reach, trying to fill spaces that consumption can't fill. We just have better PR, better marketing, better ways of hiding the cost. Henry VIII's disgusting diet is a mirror, and if we're brave enough to look into it, really look, we might see ourselves. Not the specifics, most of us aren't eating lamprey, but the pattern, the using of external things to address internal problems, the inability to say enough, the systems we build that enable our worst impulses instead of checking them. And maybe, just maybe, we can learn something. Not just, don't eat too much, though that's not bad advice, but something deeper, about power and accountability, about the systems we build and who they serve, about the difference between satisfaction and satiation, about knowing when enough is enough, because Henry never learned that, never could. The systems around him made learning impossible. Every appetite was indulged, every desire fulfilled, until he was so far gone there was no coming back. and he died grotesque and alone and rotting, surrounded by servants, but utterly isolated, having consumed everything and been satisfied by nothing. That's the fate of unchecked appetite, of power without accountability, of consumption as identity. And it hasn't stopped being relevant. If anything, it's more relevant now than ever. In a world of infinite choices and limited resources, where some people consume vastly more than they need while others starve, where appetites are cultivated and fed by systems designed to make them insatiable. Henry VIII ate himself to death 500 years ago, and we're still learning the lessons, still building systems that enable excess, still confusing consumption with satisfaction, still filling voids with stuff that can't fill them, still staying silent when we should speak, still bringing lamprey pie at midnight because that's what power demands. The kitchens are still running, the fire's still burning, the consumption's still happening, just with different food, different people, different excuses, but the same fundamental problem, the same inability to say enough, the same tragic belief that if we just consume more, just have more, just eat more, we'll finally be satisfied. We won't. Henry proved that. Died proving it, his body a testament to the lie. You can have everything and still be empty, can consume the world and still be hungry, can surround yourself with excess and die alone. That's the real disgusting truth of Henry VIII's diet. Not the menu, not the quantities, but what it reveals about human nature, about power, about appetite, about the voids we try to fill and the things we use to fill them, about systems that enable destruction and call it natural, about the fact that 500 years later, we're still making the same mistakes, still feeding the same hungers, still watching people consume themselves and calling it success, still participating in systems we know are broken because we don't know what else to do. Henry VIII died in 1547, but the appetite that killed him never dies. It just finds new hosts, new forms, new ways to consume. And until we learn to recognize it, to name it, to build systems that check it instead of enabling it, we'll keep producing our own versions of that leaking coffin, that grotesque end, that cautionary tale that nobody heeds. The disgusting diet of Henry VIII isn't just history, it's prophecy, a warning from the past about the future we're building, a reminder that appetite without limit, power without accountability, consumption without conscience, they all end the same way, in rot, in waste, in the dogs licking fluids from the chapel floor, while everyone pretends not to notice. So tonight, as you finish listening, as you think about your own relationship with food, with excess, with the things you consume and the voids you're trying to fill, maybe remember Henry. Not with judgment, not with superiority, but with recognition. Because we're all vulnerable to the same trap. The same belief that more will finally be enough. It won't. It never is. It never was, and the sooner we accept that, the sooner we can stop consuming our way to the grave. Stop enabling each other's destruction. Stop building systems that reward excess and punish restraint. Stop pretending that this is normal, sustainable, the way things have to be. Henry VIII ate till death, but he didn't have to, and neither do we. That's the lesson, the one we keep refusing to learn, the one written in grease and blood and rot across 500 years of history. The appetite will always be there, the void will always exist, but what we choose to do about it, how we respond, what systems we build, those are choices, and they matter. They determine whether we end up as cautionary tales or as people who finally figured out that satisfaction comes from within, not from without. That enough is a place, a choice, a discipline. Henry never found it. Died searching, still hungry, still empty, still reaching for one more bite. But we have to, because the alternative is his fate. And nobody deserves that. Not even a king. Not even the man who ate himself to death and left behind nothing but lessons written in his own Decay. That's the disgusting diet of Henry VIII. Not just what he ate, but what it cost, what it means, what it reveals about him, about power, about all of us, the meal that never ended, the hunger that couldn't be satisfied, the consumption that consumed everything, including in the end itself.